What if everything you know about time and how to connect with the divine was wrong? The Book of Jubilees, a forbidden text deliberately erased from history, reveals a secret that could completely change your view of spirituality. The 364-day solar calendar, established by God, was not just a way of counting the days. It was the key to living in harmony with the cosmos and the Creator. However, this truth was hidden, and a corrupt system took its place. Why? And who benefited from this? The lunar calendar, which most of us accepted as normal, was introduced by religious and political leaders with a clear objective: to centralize power, create dependency, and break the direct connection between humanity and God. This change was not just a practical matter. It was a strategy to control minds and spiritualities. Imagine the impact of discovering that sacred celebrations are out of place. God's feasts are being celebrated at the wrong time, and all of this has been orchestrated to take us away from God's purpose. But here's the real question. What was lost when we disconnected from the perfect order of time? And more importantly, what can we gain from reclaiming this hidden knowledge? Stay until the end of this video, and you will understand why the solar calendar was persecuted, who benefited from its exclusion, and how this secret can transform not just your faith, but your life. Get ready to discover a truth they never wanted you to know. Did you know that the Book of Jubilees states that God's perfect calendar has 364 days? According to the text, this solar calendar was revealed directly to Moses on Mount Sinai as a divine representation of universal harmony. It's amazing to think that such a precise system was, over the centuries, replaced by a lunar calendar. But why did this change happen? According to the Book of Jubilees, this transgression was not accidental, but a conscious decision by religious leaders who sought to centralize power and make the faithful dependent on their interpretations. The logic behind the 364-day solar calendar is fascinating. It not only aligns the seasons and natural cycles, but also preserves the sanctity of the holy festivals in an immutable way. Imagine celebrating Easter or Pentecost exactly on the day designated by God, without deviations or errors. The abandonment of this system to adopt the lunar calendar, with its fluctuations and inaccuracies, not only disordered religious celebrations, but also distanced humanity from the celestial order. The Book of Jubilees warns that this change was more than a technical error. It was a spiritual rupture. And here comes an intriguing aspect. The adoption of the lunar calendar was encouraged by external influences, such as the Babylonian and Greek cultures, which already used this system in their religious practices. For the Book of Jubilees, following these Gentile calendars was seen as a direct betrayal of the divine covenant. Religious leaders at the time may have justified the change as a practical adaptation, but the reality is that it created a gulf between the faithful and God's will. It was as if humanity had turned its back on perfection to embrace a system of convenience. Furthermore, changing the calendar also had social and political implications. A lunar calendar, which requires regular adjustments, gives religious authorities the power to determine the dates of celebrations. This control became a tool to centralize power and shape religious practice according to human rather than divine interests. Isn't it curious to think that something as everyday as counting time could be used as a form of spiritual manipulation? This is exactly what the Book of Jubilees suggests. The deletion of the original solar calendar was not just a paradigm shift. It was a deliberate disconnection from the divine order. What was once a system that reflected God's perfection was replaced by a model that, over time, lost its accuracy and spiritual meaning. And what about the impacts of this on our modern understanding of sacred time? To explore this question, we need to delve into the Book of Jubilees' explicit warnings against pagan influence, a point that will be revealed in the next topic. The Book of Jubilees leaves no room for doubt. Adopting the lunar calendar was more than a mistake. It was an act of spiritual betrayal. In Jubilees 6:36, God directly warns that following the calendars of the Gentiles, Babylonians, Greeks and other pagan nations would lead the people of Israel into error. But why was this warning forgotten or ignored? The introduction of the lunar calendar by the Babylonians, with its variations and irregular cycles, contaminated sacred celebrations, displacing them from the exact moments designated by God. This change was not just practical, but deeply symbolic. The Babylonians, known for their advanced astronomy, used a lunar astronomical calendar that fascinated other cultures. However, unlike the 364-day solar calendar, which maintained divine constancy, the lunar calendar depended on continuous adjustments. This not only disharmonized the natural cycles, but also created a dependence on the priestly elites, who needed to calibrate the dates according to the phases of the moon. For the Book of Jubilees, this represented a direct breach of the covenant with God, who had given his people a perfect and unchanging system. And this pagan influence didn't stop there. The Greeks, during the Hellenistic period, reinforced the use of the lunar calendar in their colonies, including Judea. This system was adopted as part of a larger effort at cultural unification, but it came at a significant spiritual cost. By allowing foreign practices to determine the rhythm of their celebrations, the people of Israel were separated from their original covenant. The Book of Jubilees describes this as a corruption that brought confusion and curse, turning the faithful away from the true divine order. But why would religious leaders allow this contamination? One hypothesis suggested by scholars is that the lunar calendar, with its frequent corrections, gave priests unquestionable power over the faithful. The ability to determine when sacred festivals should be celebrated was a way of centralizing authority and reinforcing the mediating role of the religious elite. In contrast, the solar calendar allowed the faithful to follow celebrations independently, without the need for priestly interpretation, something that clearly threatened the status quo. This warning against the calendars of the Gentiles has not been completely forgotten. Communities such as the Essenes, who resisted Hellenistic influence, continued to use the solar calendar described in the Book of Jubilees. For them, this practice was an act of fidelity to God and a rejection of external pressures. But was the adoption of the lunar calendar just a matter of pragmatism? Or was there something deeper, perhaps even deliberate, behind this transgression? In the next topic, we will see how the angels, mentioned in Jubilees, played a central role in the knowledge of divine timing, a knowledge that was also carefully hidden. In the Book of Jubilees 4:17, there is a fascinating statement. The 364-day solar calendar was not simply a human creation, but a gift of divine knowledge transmitted by angels to the patriarchs. These time guardian angels would have taught humanity to count the days and observe celestial cycles in harmony with God's will. But why was this high knowledge relegated to oblivion? The text suggests that the exclusion of this perfect model of time was a deliberate attempt to hide knowledge that granted spiritual autonomy to the faithful. The involvement of angels in the transmission of the calendar is not just symbolic. It establishes a direct connection between the cycles of time and the celestial order. The solar calendar, with its 364 days, reflected divine perfection and allowed humans to align themselves with the universal rhythm. Any deviation from this model was seen as a spiritual rupture. When religious elites introduced the lunar calendar, they not only disordered time, but also broke the direct link between the people and divine order. This raises the question, was it an innocent mistake or a control strategy? The exclusion of this knowledge can also be understood as a move to centralize religious authority. By hiding the solar calendar, leaders ensured that the faithful depended on its interpretations to celebrate the Khalid festivals and maintain the rhythm of religious practices. What was once an autonomous model of connection with God became a mediated system, where the faithful needed an intermediary to interpret sacred times. This transition reinforced the priestly hierarchy, but at a cost: spiritual disconnection from God's original plan. Interestingly, the involvement of angels as transmitters of time connects the Book of Jubilees to other spiritual traditions. In Hermeticism, for example, it is believed that celestial beings carry the knowledge of universal cycles and share it with humans to help them in their spiritual evolution. This convergence of ideas suggests that the solar calendar may have been part of universal knowledge, present in various cultures, but censored or modified to serve specific interests. The idea that divine knowledge was deliberately hidden to centralize power is nothing new. Throughout history, many spiritual traditions have been persecuted or distorted to suit political or religious agendas. The Book of Jubilees, when mentioning the guardian angels of time, invites us to reflect on what else may have been suppressed to prevent the faithful from accessing the fullness of their spirituality. And when we think about the consequences of this, we are led to question how the deviation to the lunar calendar, a hidden heresy according to Jubilees, broke the covenant with God, something we will explore in the next topic. The choice of the lunar calendar was not just a matter of cultural adaptation. It carried profound spiritual implications. According to the Book of Jubilees 6:34, God warned that deviation from this system would bring confusion and lead the faithful away from his covenant. This breakup was more than a simple change of calendars. It was an act that distorted sacred times and placed humanity out of harmony with the cosmos. The festivals stopped taking place at their precise times, and the link with the divine was slowly eroded. This change also reflects a subversion of spiritual values. The lunar calendar, with its irregular cycles, introduced instability into practices previously based on the constancy of the solar calendar. For the Book of Jubilees, this was a serious transgression, a step towards spiritual disorder and imitation of the pagan nations. The Babylonians and other cultures that used the lunar calendar saw it as a connection to their own gods. But for Israel, it meant a deliberate departure from divine perfection. Each irregular month was a reminder that something was out of place. Even more alarming was the centralization of power that the lunar calendar provided. It demanded continual adjustments, placing control of the celebrations in the hands of the priests. This dependence not only consolidated clerical authority, but also restricted the spiritual autonomy of the faithful. The solar calendar, on the other hand, was immutable and did not require human intervention to function. This fundamental difference reveals how the switch to the lunar calendar was not just a technical error, but a deliberate strategy of subordination. Furthermore, the impact of this rupture is still felt today. Religious practices that rely on the lunar calendar perpetuate this disconnect from the divine order described in the Book of Jubilees. Important festivals, such as Easter, are displaced and lose their synchrony with celestial cycles. It is as if humanity has traded a reliable compass for an incomplete map, guided more by human convenience than divine harmony. This disconnect leaves a spiritual gap that many don't even realize exists. And it is interesting to note that not everyone accepted this transgression in silence. Communities like the Essenes resisted change, maintaining the solar calendar as an act of fidelity to God. These records, preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, testified to a spiritual battle to preserve what was given as perfect. Amid this resistance, it is impossible not to wonder how these communities managed to preserve what they believed to be their last connection to the divine plan, a story that takes us to the mysterious world of Qumran and their struggle for heavenly order. Hidden among the caves of Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea, a group known as the Essenes fought a silent battle to preserve the divine solar calendar described in the Book of Jubilees. These often marginalized communities believed that their allegiance to the original 364-day system was an act of spiritual resistance. For them, the solar calendar was not just a method of counting days, but a living connection to the heavenly order established by God. Preserving this system was, in essence, preserving one's own alliance with the Creator. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, reveal how central the solar calendar was to the Essenes. Amid apocalyptic and liturgical texts, we find detailed records of 364-day cycles. carefully aligned with the seasons and natural cycles. These documents not only confirm the practice of the solar calendar, but also show how the Essenes viewed the adoption of the lunar calendar as a profound corruption of faith. For them, following the lunar calendar was following the ways of the Gentiles and moving away from divine perfection. The Essenes' choice of Qumran was not accidental. They retreated into the desert, moving away from Jerusalem and the influence of mainstream Judaism, which had already embraced the lunar calendar. For the Essenes, this separation was necessary to maintain the purity of their spiritual practices. Qumran became a refuge, a place where they could practice their faith, without interference from a religious elite they considered corrupt. Isolation, however, also meant that his vision of divine time was in constant threat of being erased. This resistance, however, was not enough to prevent the advancement of the lunar calendar. As time passed, the Essenes were eclipsed, and their system was consigned to oblivion until the manuscripts were rediscovered centuries later. This discovery shed light on a story of spiritual resistance that was almost erased, but it also revealed something even deeper: the idea that the divine order of time is not just an abstract concept, but a practice that shapes spirituality and connection with the divine. And when we look at the records left by the Essenes, an intriguing question arises. How did they understand the solar calendar in relation to the creation of the world? Was this view of time intrinsically linked to the harmony described in Genesis? It's fascinating to think that the timing of time could be a reflection of the order of the universe itself, a concept we'll explore more deeply as we relate the solar calendar to the creation narrative. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, everything was shaped in perfect harmony. The Book of Jubilees 2-10 reinforces this idea by associating the 364-day solar calendar with the 6-day order of creation. Each cycle, each week, was a manifestation of divine perfection, aligned to an unchanging rhythm. The number 364, so precise, reflects this perfection by being divisible by 7, keeping intact the weekly cycle established by God from the beginning. This calendar was more than a count of days. It was a direct reflection of cosmic order. The connection with Genesis is profound. Just as the 6 days of creation culminate in the 7th day of rest, the solar calendar keeps this structure intact, reaffirming the importance of the Sabbath and rest as central elements of spiritual life. In contrast, the lunar calendar, with its irregular cycles, disharmonizes this perfect count, breaking with the natural rhythm that God established. The deviation from the lunar calendar, then, is not just a practical problem. It is a rejection of the divine harmony described in Genesis. This harmony is also reflected in nature. The 364-day solar calendar perfectly aligns with the seasons, solstices and equinoxes, synchronizing human life with the cycles of creation. The Book of Jubilees presents this connection as a reminder that men were created to live in balance with the natural world, respecting time as a divine gift. When humanity abandoned this model, it also disconnected from its sacred relationship with creation, something we still feel today. The impact of this disconnect goes beyond religion. By switching from the solar calendar to the lunar one, humanity not only disrupted sacred time, but also lost a powerful spiritual tool. The solar calendar allowed the faithful to follow celebrations and the rhythms of life without depending on priestly interpretations. It was a spiritual compass, a way of being in tune with the Creator without intermediaries. Its loss was therefore more than a practical change. It was a weakening of spiritual autonomy. But not everyone accepted this change without question. The Essenes, as we have seen, fought to preserve this connection with Genesis through their practice of the solar calendar. They understood that the counting of time was not just about days and months, but about aligning human life with the eternal cycles of creation. This understanding leads us to reflect on the consequences of this rupture for sacred celebrations. After all, what happens when fundamental festivals, such as Easter, fail to occur at times determined by God? When sacred celebrations fail to follow the rhythm determined by God, all spirituality involved is distorted. According to the Book of Jubilees 637, biblical festivals such as Easter, Tabernacles, and Pentecost should be celebrated on fixed dates in the 364-day solar calendar. This system, perfect in its structure, guaranteed that each celebration was in total harmony with the natural cycles and the divine plan. The adoption of the lunar calendar, however, displaced these festivals, breaking this connection and, with it, humanity's spiritual link with God. Imagine celebrating Easter outside of God's time, like a farmer who sows outside of the right season. The impact is not just symbolic, it reverberates in the soul. Easter, for example, was originally aligned with the first harvest of spring, representing rebirth and renewal. But with the lunar calendar, this celebration began to vary, losing its synchronization with the natural cycle. Each displaced festival represents a departure from divine order and a weakening of the spiritual meaning that these dates carry. The Book of Jubilees is blunt in stating that this change brought curses and confusion. Without the solar calendar, the faithful began to depend on priestly interpretations to determine when the festival should occur. This shift was not only practical, but also political. He further centralized power in the hands of religious leaders, who decided sacred times according to their convenience. What was once a communal and independent practice became a system of control, where dates were determined by human authorities rather than divine order. Interestingly, communities such as the Essenes, who maintained the solar calendar, demonstrated a deep respect for these sacred times. For them, each celebration at the right time was an act of fidelity to God and a return to heavenly order. These communities saw the abandonment of the solar calendar as a serious transgression, a betrayal of the divine covenant. Their manuscripts show us that they believed these displaced festivals were not recognized by God, but were seen as empty rituals, disconnected from their original meaning. And this leads us to a greater reflection. What do we lose when we move away from the divine order in time? Have these changes, promoted by convenience and human power, disconnected us from something essential? Archaeology offers us valuable clues to answer this question. Discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls show us that the solar calendar was widely practiced and validated, before being suppressed by political and religious interests. This evidence is the central theme of what we will explore next. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 in the Qumran caves, not only revealed a different view of early Judaism, but also provided concrete evidence that the solar calendar was widely practiced before it was suppressed. Among the texts found, fragments of the Book of Jubilees reinforce the centrality of the solar calendar in the spiritual life of communities that resisted rabbinic hegemony. These manuscripts, preserved for centuries in desert isolation, are a powerful testament to a tradition that was deliberately excluded from mainstream Judaism. Archaeology plays a crucial role here. These fragments reveal that the solar calendar was not just a fringe practice. It was widely accepted and followed by entire communities, such as the Essenes. These texts describe 364-day cycles, minutely aligned with the seasons and sacred events. Most impressively, these discoveries challenge the narrative that the lunar calendar was the only way to tell time. They prove that there was an ongoing theological and cultural battle, and the solar calendar was one of the biggest victims of this dispute. But why was the solar calendar suppressed? The answer, it seems, is in control. The lunar calendar, with its need for frequent adjustments, gave religious leaders a tool of power. They had the prerogative to determine sacred times, guaranteeing their authority over the faithful. The solar calendar, fixed and immutable, removed this dependence, allowing anyone to connect directly with the divine order. This spiritual autonomy was seen as a threat by religious elites, who preferred to eliminate this practice in favor of a more centralized model. The Book of Jubilees, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, also gives us clues about how strategic this suppression was. He describes the solar calendar as an integral part of the divine covenant, a gift that reflected the harmony of the cosmos. Their exclusion, therefore, was not just a theological choice, but a deliberate break with a system that promoted spiritual independence. The story of the disappearance of the solar calendar is also the story of a disconnect between humanity and sacred time. These archaeological discoveries make us reflect on what else may have been hidden. If something as fundamental as timekeeping has been altered by human interests, what does that say about our understanding of spirituality and history? The Dead Sea Scrolls offer a glimpse of a world where the solar calendar was more than a method. It was a way of living in harmony with God. And when considering its suppression, we are led to think about the impact of this departure on early Christianity and the exclusion of practices that could have transformed our relationship with the divine. The Book of Jubilees is not just a historical work. It presents a concept that transcends human time, describing the 364-day solar calendar as an essential tool for understanding apocalyptic cycles. In Jubilees 50 to 4 to 5, God reveals that this system not only regulates earthly time, but also serves as a divine clock, synchronized with cosmic and spiritual events culminating in the end times. Each Jubilee, a 49-year cycle, would be a milestone in the divine plan, bringing humanity closer to its redemption or judgment. This view places the solar calendar on a level far beyond a simple counting method. It becomes a key to unlocking the mysteries of the apocalypse, something that has been deliberately suppressed over the centuries. The adoption of the lunar calendar not only disrupted sacred celebrations, but also obscured the ability to interpret the prophetic times described in Scripture. This leads us to question, how much do we lose by moving away from this God-ordained system? The Dead Sea Scrolls provide fascinating context for this question. At Qumran, communities like the Essenes used the solar calendar not only to determine festivals, but as a way to understand the divine plan. They believed that each cycle was directly connected to the cosmos, and that calendar accuracy was critical to aligning humanity with the celestial order. For them, ignorance regarding this system was a serious spiritual failure, a departure from God. And there is something even more intriguing: the role of the solar calendar in early Christianity. Communities such as the Nazarenes also adopted aspects of this system, suggesting that it was not unique to Judaism but part of a universal understanding of sacred time. However, with the exclusion of the Book of Jubilees from the biblical canon, this knowledge was gradually forgotten, replaced by a calendar that prioritized political and religious expediency. This makes us reflect on the impact of this loss on our vision of the apocalypse. By understanding the solar calendar as a divine clock, we are faced with an uncomfortable truth. We have been removed from a system that not only marked the days, but also guided humanity's spirituality. This disconnect takes us to the heart of the theological conflict that resulted in Rabbinic Judaism's rejection of this model. After all, why was something so fundamental discarded in favor of a lunar system? This is where we find the key to understanding the interests that shape time as we know it today. The solar calendar, presented in the Book of Jubilees, represented a system of counting time so precise and harmonious that it should be unquestionable. However, it was abandoned by Rabbinic Judaism in favor of the lunar calendar, which offered greater flexibility for adjustments and adaptations. This apparently practical choice hides a deeper theological conflict. The solar calendar was more than an organizational tool. It was a symbol of the divine covenant, a direct connection to the heavenly order. His rejection, therefore, marked the beginning of a deliberate disconnection from that harmony. After the Babylonian exile, religious leaders faced the task of unifying the people of Israel in a context of cultural and religious diversity. The lunar calendar, already used by the Babylonians, offered a strategic advantage. Its flexibility allowed it to accommodate regional variations and required continuous adjustments, centralizing power in the hands of the priests. This contrasted sharply with the solar calendar, which, due to its precision, allowed the faithful to follow celebrations independently, without relying on priestly intervention. This conflict also reflects a struggle for power within religious institutions. The solar calendar, with its simplicity and constancy, was a threat to the control exercised by religious leaders. It removed the need for a mediating class, allowing the faithful to connect directly with the sacred times. On the other hand, the lunar calendar required continuous validation from religious authorities, reinforcing the priestly hierarchy. This change, therefore, was not only theological but also political, ensuring that power remained centralized. Another intriguing point is that this rejection was not unanimous. Groups such as the Essenes and other marginal communities continued to use the solar calendar as an act of spiritual resistance. For them, abandoning this system was equivalent to betraying the covenant with God. The Dead Sea Scrolls reveal that these groups considered the lunar calendar a hidden heresy, a transgression that distanced humanity from divine order. This clash between the solar and lunar calendar is a reflection of broader tensions within Judaism at the time. And as we look at the impact of this rejection, we realize that it shaped not only Judaism, but also Christianity and other religious traditions. The centralization of power and the suppression of alternative practices resulted in the exclusion of the Book of Jubilees and its sacred time system. This leads us to question how this decision influenced humanity's relationship with the divine. And by making this connection, we find clues to understanding the role of the solar calendar in early Christianity and its exclusion at the Council of Nicaea. In early Christianity, the Book of Jubilees played a significant role in communities such as the Nazarenes, who sought to preserve Jewish traditions while following the teachings of Christ. This book, which emphasizes the 364-day solar calendar, not only influenced the counting of time, but also shaped religious practices based on divine harmony. However, as Christianity expanded and sought to unify, the Book of Jubilees became a target of deliberate exclusion, seen as incompatible with the Church's interests in consolidating its doctrine and authority. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was a turning point in this process. Under the leadership of Emperor Constantine, the Church sought to establish a single narrative that would unify the Roman Empire. The lunar calendar, which had already been adopted by Rabbinic Judaism, offered flexibility to align Christian festivals, such as Passover, with local cultural practices. This decision not only rejected the solar calendar, but also marginalized texts such as the Book of Jubilees, which advocated a different view of time and spirituality. The exclusion of the Book of Jubilees also reflects a tension between spiritual autonomy and institutional control. His detailed descriptions of the solar calendar and his emphasis on direct connection with God threatened the centralization of power in the church hierarchy. By promoting a religious practice that did not depend on intermediaries, the Book of Jubilees offered a dangerous alternative to the model the church was trying to build. Its exclusion, therefore, was strategic, ensuring that the official doctrine was the only voice. Another interesting aspect is that this exclusion did not occur without resistance. Early Christian communities continued to value the Book of Jubilees, preserving copies and practicing its instructions even after its official rejection. The discovery of fragments of this book among the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrates that it remained relevant in marginal circles, resisting attempts at erasure. These groups saw the Book of Jubilees as a spiritual anchor in a world where institutional control was growing rapidly, and the impact of this exclusion reverberates to this day. The absence of the Book of Jubilees in the official biblical canon deprives us of a deeper understanding of sacred time and the relationship between the divine and the human. Their exclusion forces us to reflect on how power shaped the spiritual practices and religious narratives that have come down to us. But when considering this disconnect, an inevitable question arises. What have we lost by abandoning the divine order of the solar calendar? which the Book of Jubilees describes as reflecting the celestial kingdom. This theme leads us to the broader idea of divine order in time and how it is reflected in our understanding of creation and the cosmos. The counting of time in the Book of Jubilees is not presented as a simple chronological system. It is described as a reflection of divine order, an earthly representation of heavenly harmony. In Jubilees 6:38, God declares that the 364-day solar calendar symbolizes the perfection and stability of the divine kingdom. Each weekly cycle, each season, is a manifestation of God's plan, designed to guide humanity in tune with the cosmos. Abandoning this system is not just a practical deviation. It is a symbolic rejection of the order that governs all creation. This connection between time and the divine is also evident in the numbers that structure the solar calendar. The number 364, perfectly divisible by 7, reinforces the centrality of the weekly cycle, instituted by God in creation. By breaking with this model, the lunar calendar introduced an irregular rhythm, disconnected from the cosmic pattern. For the authors of the Book of Jubilees, this change was not just inconvenient. It was a form of spiritual rebellion, a rupture of the covenant with God that disordered humanity's relationship with the universe. The impact of this abandonment goes beyond the symbolic. When sacred time is disorganized, religious celebrations lose their anchoring in natural cycles, becoming less meaningful. Feasts like Passover and Tabernacles, which were supposed to align with the seasons and harvest, became mobile and subject to human adjustments. This disconnection diminished the spirituality of the celebrations, transforming them into rituals more focused on convenience than on reverence for divine order. This loss of connection with the divine order of time has also weakened humanity's ability to understand its place in the cosmos. The solar calendar was not just functional. It was pedagogical, teaching humanity about the interdependence between the divine, the natural, and the human. By suppressing this practice, religious institutions have not only centralized power but also obscured a fundamental spiritual truth. That time is a language through which God communicates His will to creation. And this disconnect leads us to a crucial question. What might happen if we reconnected our understanding of time to the divine order described in the Book of Jubilees? As we reflected on this, we realized that this restoration would not only be a historical correction, but also a spiritual renewal. This theme is particularly relevant when we consider the impact of the solar calendar on early Christianity and its deliberate exclusion to further political and religious interests, an issue that resonates deeply to this day.